You have been feeling it for days now, maybe even weeks. A quiet shift beneath the surface of your life, something you could not name but could not ignore either. A sense that something is about to change, that the ground beneath your feet is moving, that the atmosphere around your life is being rearranged by hands far greater than your own. You have tried to shake it off. You have tried to go back to the routine, back to the ordinary rhythm of waking and working and sleeping. But something inside you keeps pulling you back to this moment, back to this feeling, back to this knowing that will not let you rest. That feeling is not anxiety. That feeling is not confusion. That is the voice of heaven getting your attention, and you would do well to listen, because what is about to be spoken over your life in these next few moments was not assembled by chance. This message found you. You did not find it. Before we go any further, understand something foundational. You are not like the rest. That is not flattery. That is not the kind of empty encouragement that people throw around to make others feel better. That is a spiritual reality that has been proven over and over again by the way your life has unfolded, by the way people have responded to you, by the way rooms have shifted when you walked in, by the way conversations changed when you opened your mouth, by the way silence fell when you simply stood still. You have always been different, and deep down, even when it felt like a burden, you have always known it. The ones around you knew it too. That is why they watched you the way they did. That is why they studied you. There is a particular kind of attention that the world gives to things it cannot explain. When something defies the categories that ordinary minds use to make sense of the world, when something refuses to be neatly filed away into a familiar box, the natural response is prolonged, searching, almost obsessive observation. People stare at what they cannot understand. They circle it. They discuss it in rooms where it is not present. They analyze it in conversations that have nothing to do with the subject at hand. They return to it again and again, not because they want to celebrate it, but because they cannot settle the unresolved question it presents to them. You were that question. You have always been that question. And the reason they studied you so deeply, the reason they watched your every move with such careful attention, is because they could not figure you out. They tried. They really did try. But you were never meant to be figured out by eyes that have not been given the vision to see what God places inside a person. Think about your life for a moment. Think about the people who watched you from a distance before they ever said a word to you. Think about the ones who seemed to know things about you before you had done anything. Think about the conversations you were not supposed to hear, where people were discussing you, trying to map the terrain of who you are, trying to predict what you would do next, trying to place you in a category that would make you manageable and familiar. But you never stayed in any of those categories, did you? Every time they thought they had you figured out, you shifted. Every time they believed they had drawn the borders of who you were, you exceeded them. Every time they tried to write the final word about your life, you turned the page and started a new chapter they had not seen coming. That was not an accident. That was divine architecture. God designed you to be beyond the reach of ordinary comprehension, because what He placed inside you was never ordinary. To begin with, you carry something that the world has no language for. Science cannot fully measure it. Psychology cannot fully classify it. Sociology cannot fully explain it. There is a grace on your life, a mark, an anointing, a weight of glory that sits on you differently than it sits on the people around you. And that weight, that grace, that invisible signature of heaven on everything you are, is precisely what has made you so difficult to categorize. The people who studied you were not wrong to be fascinated. They were simply looking at something that operates on a frequency beyond what the natural eye can comprehend. They were looked at a chosen one and trying to understand it with tools built for ordinary living. Of course, they could not figure you out. You were not designed to be figured out. You were designed to be marveled at, to be walked with, to be witnessed as a demonstration of the power and wisdom of God, made visible in human form. Now let us talk about the weight of that. Because being chosen is not always comfortable. Being the one that others study, the one that others cannot quite explain, the one that seems to operate on a different level, that is not a life without cost. You have felt the isolation of it. You have felt the loneliness that comes from being in a room full of people and still feeling like no one truly sees you. You have felt the exhaustion of being perpetually misread, of being reduced to assumptions and projections by people who could not take the time to understand the real depth of who you are. You have felt the sting of being underestimated, of watching smaller versions of your gifts be celebrated in others, while yours were met with suspicion or silence. Every sleepless night, every tear shed in a room where no one was watching, every prayer whispered in the dark, when you were not sure anything was listening, all of that was not wasted. All of that was being woven into something eternal. Heaven was not absent in those moments. Heaven was building you in those moments. Psalm chapter 139 verse 14 declares that you are fearfully and wonderfully made. That word fearfully does not simply mean carefully. It carries the weight of something that inspires awe, something that commands reverence, something that makes the observer stop and recognize they are in the presence of a work that only God could have authored. You are that work. Every line of you, every contradiction that people could not reconcile, every layer of you that resisted, their simplification was a brushstroke of the divine. They studied you because the artwork of heaven was hanging in front of them and they could not look away. They studied you because God made you in such a way that your very existence poses a question that only He can answer. This is not coincidence. This is divine intervention. The fact that you are here, watching this, feeling this, resonating with every word being spoken, is not the result of an algorithm making a lucky guess. Heaven has pressed pause on the ordinary flow of your day to deliver something directly into your spirit. You are standing at a threshold. The confusion of others about who you are, the years of being misread, mishandled, and misjudged, all of it has been preparation for a revelation that is now beginning to unfold. What was hidden in you is about to become undeniable. What was studied from a distance is about to be witnessed up close. And the world that spent so long trying to figure you out is about to realize that it was never their job to understand you. It was simply their privilege to witness you. Type the number 777 in the comments right now if you feel this in your spirit. Type 777 if you know that what God placed inside you is beyond what the people around you have been able to comprehend. Type 777 as a declaration that you receive this word, that you accept this calling, that you are ready to step into the fullness of everything heaven has designed you for. And if this message is already stirring something deep inside you, do not keep it to yourself. Share it with someone who has been told they are too much, someone who has been studied but never truly seen, someone who is waiting for the confirmation that their difference is not a defect but a divine design. Like this video, subscribe to this channel, and stay close, because what God is about to speak into your life over the course of this message is only the beginning of what He has been preparing you to hear. You were never easy to read, and that is exactly the point. They were watching you long before you ever noticed. That is the thing about the kind of attention that confusion generates. It is not loud. It is not obvious. It does not announce itself with fanfare or declare its presence with honesty. It is quiet, careful, and deliberate. It moves in the background of social situations, operating just beneath the surface of normal interaction, cloaked in the language of casual conversation, while its real purpose is something else entirely. They were not just making small talk when they asked you those questions. They were not just being friendly when they lingered a little longer than necessary. They were gathering information. They were collecting data points. They were building a file on you in the archives of their own minds, cross-referencing what you said against what you did, measuring what you claimed against what you demonstrated, trying to find the gap, the inconsistency, the crack in the foundation that would finally make you make sense to them. But they never found it. And that silence, that absence of the contradiction they were looking for, is what deepened the study. You have to understand the nature of what was happening in those moments. When someone cannot explain you through normal means, when the usual templates they use to classify people do not apply, the human mind does not simply let it go. It becomes more invested. It leans in closer. It watches with greater intensity, because the mystery has now become a challenge, and something in the architecture of the human ego refuses to walk away from a puzzle it believes it should be able to solve. They watched you before they spoke, because speaking too soon would have revealed the depth of their confusion. And pride does not like to confess confusion. So they observed first. They waited. They studied the way you moved through a room, the way you responded to pressure, the way your face held its composure in situations where others were visibly crumbling. They watched you process. They watched you think. They watched you make decisions that did not follow the logic they expected, and then they watched those decisions produce results that their logic could not have predicted. And every time that happened, the file got thicker and the question got louder. Think about the ones who came close to you under the pretense of friendship, but whose real motivation was intelligence gathering. You may have known it at the time, or perhaps you only understood it in retrospect after the season had passed and clarity had settled like morning light on everything that had taken place. There were people in your life who asked more questions than they answered. People who seemed to know more about your situation than someone casually connected to you should have known. People who had studied your history, your patterns, your tendencies, your triggers, not because they loved you, but because they were trying to find the lever that would give them control over something they could not understand, and therefore could not stand to see operating freely. Control is always the goal when comprehension fails. If you cannot understand something, the next impulse is to contain it. And so the study of you was never neutral. It was always strategic. It was always about power. But here is what they did not account for. Here is the thing that all of their watching and listening and analyzing and discussing could never have prepared them for. The source of what you carry is not accessible through observation. You cannot reverse engineer the anointing of God. You cannot dissect the divine and extract its formula through careful enough study. What heaven places inside a chosen vessel operates according to a logic that is entirely outside the parameters of human intelligence, and no amount of watching, no depth of analysis, no breadth of conversation can unlock what God has sealed with His own hand. They studied you for years. Some of them dedicated significant portions of their emotional and mental energy to trying to decode who you are and how you work. And after all of that, they were no closer to the answer than when they started, because the answer was never in you in any way that they could access. The answer was in God, who made you, who marked You who breathed purpose into you before you ever took your first breath in this world. Jeremiah chapter 1 verse 5 carries a weight that chosen ones must sit with until it becomes more than a verse and becomes a reality they live inside. Before God formed you in the womb, He knew you. Before you were born, He set you apart. He appointed you. That means that every complexity that confuses the people around you, every layer of your personality that resists their simplification, every dimension of your character that seems to contradict what they expected, all of it was known and designed before they ever met you. They are studying an original. They are trying to copy a manuscript that was written in a language only the author understands. And the frustration they feel, that restless, unresolved sense of being close to an answer that keeps moving just out of reach, that is not your problem to solve. That is the natural consequence of standing in the presence of a divine work and expecting to comprehend it through human means alone. Now consider the specific ways that their watching manifested in your life. There were the ones who watched from a distance and made up stories to fill the gaps that their understanding could not bridge. Because when observation does not produce comprehension, the mind begins to invent. It writes narratives. It assigns motivations. It constructs explanations that say more about the observer than they do about the subject. And so you became, in the minds of people who had never taken the time to truly know you, a character in a story they were writing about themselves. Their jealousy became your arrogance in the telling. Their confusion became your secretiveness. Their inability to predict you became your unreliability. They took the parts of you that they could not explain and renamed them with words that fit their emotional experience of being confronted with something beyond their understanding. They called you difficult when what they meant was unpredictable. They called you cold when what they meant was uncontrollable. They called you strange when what they meant was unlike anything they had encountered before. And you carried those labels for a time, did you not? Some of them stuck in ways that were painful, in ways that made you question whether the problem was with them or with you, in ways that planted seeds of doubt about whether the things that made you different were gifts or defects. You may have spent seasons of your life trying to make yourself more readable, more predictable, more manageable, more ordinary, not because that is what you wanted to be, but because the exhaustion of being perpetually misunderstood made the idea of simplicity feel like relief. You tried to fold yourself into smaller shapes. You tried to speak in shorter sentences and want simpler things and dream quieter dreams. You tried to turn down the volume of everything that made you distinctly, unmistakably you, and it never worked, because you cannot diminish what God designed for expansion. You cannot quiet what heaven built to thunder. You cannot reduce to ordinary what was made for the extraordinary. No matter how much social pressure is applied, or how many voices insist that your difference is a liability. The watching was never just social curiosity. In many cases, it was spiritual. People who are operating under the influence of darkness have an awareness of spiritual things that goes beyond what they consciously understand. Something in the unseen realm recognizes the mark on a chosen vessel, and that recognition produces a response, sometimes curiosity, sometimes hostility, sometimes a compulsive need to be near you while simultaneously trying to diminish you. The enemy is strategic, he does not waste resources studying people who pose no threat. The fact that you were watched, that you were analyzed, that so much attention was directed at the question of who you are and how you work is itself a testimony to the weight of what you carry. Ordinary people do not generate this kind of sustained, almost obsessive observation. Chosen ones do. David was watched before he was crowned. Joseph was observed by his brothers long before he was elevated above them. Daniel was studied by his enemies in Babylon, who searched desperately for grounds of accusation and found nothing, because what God had placed in Daniel was beyond the reach of their investigations. The watching is not new. The being unable to figure out God's chosen ones is a pattern that runs through the whole of sacred history, because heaven consistently places its most significant assignments inside vessels that the world cannot decode. The confusion of the observer has always been the protection of the chosen. What they cannot understand, they cannot effectively oppose. What they cannot predict, they cannot successfully ambush. The very complexity that made you so difficult to read was functioning as armor around the assignment on your life. So the next time a memory surfaces of someone studying you, watching you, talking about you in rooms where you were not present, trying to piece together the puzzle of who you are and why you operate the way you do not feel the old sting of being misunderstood. Feel instead the quiet confidence of someone who now understands why the watching happened. You were being studied because you were carrying something worth studying. You were being analyzed because the mark on your life was visible, even to those who did not have the spiritual vocabulary to name what they were seeing. You were being observed because heaven had placed inside you something so significant, so rare, so distinctly chosen, that even the ones who wished you harm could not look away. That is not weakness. That has never been weakness. That is the weight of glory resting on a life that was made for more than the world you were placed in could comfortably contain. They watched you because you were worth watching, and they could never figure you out because you were never theirs to understand. There is a particular kind of peace that unsettles people. Not the peace that comes from having everything figured out, not the peace that arrives when all the problems are solved and the circumstances are comfortable and the future is clearly mapped. That kind of peace people understand because it has an obvious source. You can point to it, explain it, justify it with a list of reasons why everything is fine. But the peace you carry is different. The peace that rests on your life does not wait for the circumstances to cooperate. It does not require permission from the situation. It does not rise and fall with the news of the day or the behavior of the people around you or the state of your finances or the condition of your relationships. It is a peace that exists independently of everything the world uses to measure whether a person has reason to be at rest. And that kind of peace, that deep, anchored, immovable stillness at the center of who you are, is something that the people around you have never been able to make sense of. They watched you go through things that should have broken you. They observed you standing in the middle of storms that leveled other people, and they waited for you to fall, not always because they wanted you to fall, but because the laws of ordinary human experience told them that you should. They had a reasonable expectation, based on everything they knew about how pressure works on a person, that what you were going through would eventually crack the surface of your composure and reveal the chaos underneath. And when it did not, when you kept standing, kept functioning, kept moving forward with a steadiness that defied the weight of what was pressing against you, they did not celebrate it. They were disturbed by it, because what you were demonstrating was not something they had a category for. It was not resilience in the way they understood resilience. It was not stubbornness or denial or emotional suppression. It was something else entirely, something that seemed to come from a place deeper than psychology and stronger than willpower. It was the peace of God, and Philippians chapter 4 verse 7 tells us that it surpasses all understanding. It surpasses the understanding of the person carrying it. How much more does it surpass the understanding of the ones watching from the outside? Your stillness made them restless because stillness in the middle of chaos is a form of power that the world does not know how to process. The world operates on a system of visible reactions. It expects that pressure will produce panic, that loss will produce despair, that opposition will produce retreat, that rejection will produce collapse. These are the predictable equations of ordinary human experience, and most people live their entire lives within the boundaries of those equations. When you refused to, when you kept your peace in the middle of what should have been a breakdown, when you held your ground with a quietness that had nothing to do with indifference and everything to do with a trust in God that ran deeper than the crisis at hand, you violated every expectation they had set for you. And that violation was threatening in a way they could not always articulate, but could deeply feel. Think about the specific moments in your life when your calm in a crisis became the subject of someone else's conversation. Think about the times people said you were too composed, too unbothered, too quiet in situations where they felt you should have been more visibly distressed. There is a social expectation around suffering. People expect it to look a certain way, to be performed in a recognizable manner, to follow a script that confirms to everyone watching that the person in pain is properly undone by it. When you did not follow that script, when your pain was private and your processing was internal and your garden handling thing the send place while the world waited for your public unraveling, people did not know what to do with that. Some called it pride. Some called it coldness. Some even went so far as to question whether you had truly been through what you claimed. Because surely, they reasoned if it had been as hard as you said, you would look more broken by now. But broken was never your assignment. Bent, yes. Pressed, absolutely. Stretched to the outer limits of what you believed you could endure without question. But broken, no. Because Isaiah chapter 40, 3 verse 2 carries a promise that was written with your name in mind. When you pass through the waters, God said, I will be with you. When you walk through fire, you will not be burned. Notice that the promise is not that you will avoid the water or be spared the fire. The promise is that in the middle of it, the presence of God will be the thing that determines the outcome. You walked through things that should have drowned you, and you came out standing. You passed through fires that should have reduced you to ash, and you emerged without even the smell of smoke on you. That was not your doing. That was the covering of heaven on a life that was too important to the purposes of God to be destroyed by the plans of the enemy. Your stillness was a testimony every time it showed up in a crisis. It was a sermon preached without words to every person who watched you maintain your footing when the ground was shaking. They may not have received the message immediately. They may not have had the spiritual vocabulary to name what they were witnessing. But something in the atmosphere of every room where you held your peace in the middle of pressure was shifted by the presence of that peace. Something in the spirit realm was declared by the simple act of you refusing to be moved. Demons hate this in a chosen one. Darkness cannot work with a target that will not be rattled. When you refused to panic, when you chose trust over terror, when you let the peace of God stand guard over your heart and your mind. In the middle of the very situation the enemy designed to destabilize you, you were engaging in spiritual warfare more powerful than any loud declaration or dramatic act of faith. Your stillness was the warfare, and the people watching, even the ones who did not understand it, were being ministered to by it, whether they knew it or not. Because there is something that happens in the human heart when it witnesses a peace. that cannot be explained by circumstances. A question gets planted, a longing gets stirred. A part of the observer begins to wonder, quietly, privately, in the moments between sleep and waking, what it would feel like to have that, what it would mean to carry that kind of anchor. What kind of God produces that kind of quiet in a person who has every reason to be in chaos? Your peace was evangelism. Your stillness was a light. And every time they came close to study it, they were coming close to the source of it, whether they ever admitted that or not. Now, if this word is landing in your spirit today, if something in what is being spoken is touching a part of you that needed to hear it, we want to take a moment to say something with sincerity. This channel exists because we believe in the power of a word spoken at the right time, delivered to the right heart, in the right season. Every message is built with prayer and intention, and it is our genuine desire that what reaches your ears reaches your spirit as well. If this ministry has brought value to your life, and you feel led to help us continue and sustain this work, there is a support link in the description below. It is completely voluntary. There is no obligation and no pressure. Whether you are able to give or not, we are deeply grateful that you are here, that you are listening, and that you are part of this community. Your presence here matters more than we can say. And if this message has stirred something in you today, if you felt seen, or confirmed or called higher by what has been spoken, please take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear it. There is a person in your life right now who has been told their calm is coldness, whose peace has been mistaken for pride, who is carrying a stillness they have never been given permission to celebrate. Send this to them. Let heaven use you to deliver a word that someone else has been waiting for. And if you are not yet subscribed to this channel, please do it now, because what God is releasing through this space is only going to grow deeper and more powerful in the days ahead, and you do not want to miss what is coming. Your stillness was never emptiness. It was always evidence. Evidence of a God who dwells inside you, who holds you when everything around you is shaking, who anchors you to a peace so deep that the world studies it and still cannot name it. Let them study. Let them watch. Let them try to figure out the source of what they see in you. Because the more they look, the closer they get to the only answer that was ever going to satisfy the question. And that answer is not you. That answer is the God who made you and who lives in you and who has been the source of your stillness from the very beginning. There is a particular kind of cruelty that wears the mask of concern. It comes dressed in the language of care, wrapped in the tone of someone who simply wants what is best for you, delivered with just enough warmth to make you question whether what you are sensing is real, or whether you are being unfair to someone who means well. It says things like, "I am only telling you this because I care about you," before it proceeds to dismantle something sacred about who you are. It frames your sensitivity as instability, your depth as impracticality, your silence as avoidance, your tears as weakness, your compassion as naivety. It takes the most beautiful and most powerful things about you and repackages them in the language of liability, and then presents the whole package back to you as though it is doing you a favor by helping you see yourself more clearly. That is not clarity. That is a distortion. And you have lived inside that distortion for long enough. They mistook your depth for weakness because depth is invisible to eyes that have never learned to look below the surface. The people who misread you were not necessarily evil in every case. Some of them were simply operating at a level of perception that could not access what you were actually made of. They looked at the softness in your eyes and called it fragility, not knowing that the softest things in the natural world are often the most enduring. Water is soft. Water is gentle. Water yields and flows and takes the shape of whatever contains it. And yet water carves canyons. Water splits stone. Water reshapes entire landscapes over time, not through violence but through persistence, not through hardness but through a commitment to movement that nothing in its path can permanently stop. That is what you are. You are not fragile because you feel deeply. You are not weak because you weep. You are not vulnerable because you open yourself to the weight of other people's pain. That depth, that capacity to feel what others close themselves off from, is not a soft underbelly waiting to be exploited. It is the very thing that makes you capable of the kind of endurance that leaves shallow people bewildered. Your silence was another thing they got wrong. In a world that equates volume with strength and noise with power, your willingness to be quiet was consistently misinterpreted as an absence of something. They thought you had nothing to say. They thought you were intimidated, overwhelmed, outmatched by whatever situation was unfolding in front of you. They saw your silence and filled it with their own assumptions, projecting onto the open space of your quiet whatever narrative made the most sense to their own limited framework. They called it passivity. They called it submission. They called it a lack of confidence or a deficit of courage. But what was actually happening in your silence was something they never considered, because it required a level of spiritual discernment they had not developed. What was happening in your silence was strategy. What was happening in your silence was communion. You were listening when they were talking. You were hearing when they were performing. You were receiving from God in the space that their noise never gave them access to, because the frequency on which heaven communicates requires a quietness of spirit that very few people are willing to cultivate. Proverbs chapter 17 verse 28 tells us that even a fool is counted wise when he holds his peace, and that a person who shuts his lips is considered a person of understanding. But what you carry goes beyond the wisdom of strategic silence. Your quiet is not merely tactical, it is relational. It comes from a place of being so deeply connected to the voice of the one who made you that you have learned over time to wait for his word before you offer your own. You have been burned enough times by speaking before the season was right. You have watched enough of your pearls be cast before those who could not appreciate their value. And so you learn to hold things in the secret place, to let God weigh your words before they left your mouth, to trust that what he was forming in the quiet would be far more powerful than anything your immediate reaction could have produced. That is not weakness. That is the discipline of a person who has been taught by experience that the timing of heaven is always more precise than the impulse of the flesh. And then there was your refusal to react. That, perhaps more than anything else, is what they could not accept. Because the system of power that most people operate within depends on reaction. It depends on the ability to provoke a response, to push a button and produce a predictable output, to know that if you apply a certain kind of pressure to a person, they will respond in a certain kind of way. That predictability is the foundation of control. If someone can map your triggers, they can manage you. If they know exactly what will make you angry or afraid or defensive or desperate, they hold a form of power over you that requires no physical force to exercise. And so the people who wanted influence over your life, whether they were conscious of it or not, were constantly testing you. They were applying pressure in various forms and watching carefully for the reaction that would hand them the leverage they were looking for. They poked at your insecurities. They challenged your decisions. They questioned your worth in subtle, sometimes beautifully disguised ways. They manufactured situations designed to destabilize you and then positioned themselves close enough to observe the results. And when you did not react the way they expected, something shifted in the dynamic. You can probably remember specific moments when this happened. A moment when someone said something designed to wound, and you responded with a calm that caught them completely off guard. A moment when a situation was engineered to provoke your fear, and you met it with a trust in God that refused to be moved. A moment when the pressure that should have sent you into crisis instead seemed to settle something in you, to press you deeper into a rootedness that the force applied could not displace. In those moments, you were not simply displaying admirable self-control. You were operating in the Spirit. You were living out Romans chapter 8 verse 6, which tells us that to be spiritually minded is life and peace. The peace you demonstrated was not manufactured, it was not performed. It was the organic fruit of a spirit that had been genuinely transformed by the presence of God, and no amount of provocation could reach deep enough to dislodge what heaven had planted at the core of you. But here is what that refusal to react cost you emotionally, because we must be honest about this. Every time you held your peace in the face of provocation, there was an internal battle that the watching world never saw. The composure on the outside did not mean there was no storm on the inside. It meant that you had made a choice, sometimes a brutally difficult choice, to trust God with the outcome rather than take the situation into your own hands. It meant that you swallowed things that deserved to be said, and released things that deserved to be held on to, and surrendered outcomes that you had every right to fight for, because you believed, even in your most exhausted moments, that God saw what you saw and would handle what you could not handle without losing yourself in the process. That choice, made over and over again in the hardest seasons of your life, was not weakness. It was the most sophisticated form of spiritual warfare that a human being can engage in. It was the kind of faith that does not look dramatic from the outside, but that moves mountains in the unseen realm. Isaiah chapter 53, the passage that describes the suffering servant, contains a line that chosen ones carry in their bones even when they have never consciously memorized it. He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. That silence, that refusal to defend, that willingness to trust the justice of God over the vindication of men, was not the behavior of someone who had accepted defeat. It was the posture of someone who knew that the final word on their life belonged to a voice that no human opposition could silence. You have carried that same posture, not perfectly, not without moments of fracture and grief, but consistently, persistently, and at a cost that only God has fully witnessed and fully honored. The people who called your sensitivity weakness were speaking from a poverty of inner life that they probably did not even know they had. It takes nothing to be hard. Hardness is what the world produces in people it has repeatedly hurt without comfort. Hardness is the scar tissue of an unhealed wound, but softness that has survived fire, tenderness that has been maintained through betrayal, compassion that keeps showing up even after it has been repeatedly taken advantage of. That is not weakness. That is the rarest form of spiritual strength that exists. That is the character of a person who has been through enough to justify bitterness and chosen grace instead, who has seen enough ugliness to justify cynicism and maintained wonder instead, who has been hurt enough to justify closing off and kept the door of their heart open instead, because they understood at some level that the love of God flowing through them was too important to the world around them to be shut down by the actions of people who did not know what they were doing. They read you wrong from the beginning. They saw depth and called it weakness. They saw silence and called it emptiness. They saw composure and called it coldness. They saw grace and called it defeat. Every misreading was a revelation, not of who you are, but of how limited the lens was through which they were looking. And you, beloved chosen one, were never the problem. You were always the answer they were not yet equipped to receive. There is something that darkness cannot do with light. It cannot absorb it, cannot neutralize it, cannot convince it to become something other than what it is. Darkness can surround light. It can press against it from every direction, can crowd it from all sides, can do everything within its nature to overwhelm the luminance that refuses to yield. But it cannot extinguish it. Not really, not permanently, because light and darkness do not operate as equals in a contest where either side might win on any given day. They operate according to a law that was established before the foundations of the world were laid. A law that says wherever light is genuinely present, darkness must give way. It has no choice. It is not a matter of willpower or strategy or the relative strength of the forces involved. It is simply the nature of what light is and what darkness is not. And you, chosen one, are a carrier of that light. You have always been a carrier of that light, and everything that has ever been launched against you, every attempt to dim you, discourage you, define you in terms smaller than your calling, every whisper that told you the fire in you was going out, was operating against a law it could never ultimately defeat. But let us not speak of this in abstractions. Let us talk about what it actually looked like in your life, because the attempts to extinguish what God placed in you were not always dramatic. They were not always obvious acts of hostility that announced themselves clearly as opposition. Some of the most effective attempts to dim your light came wrapped in the mundane, woven into the fabric of everyday life in ways that were easy to miss individually, but devastating in their cumulative effect. It was the chronic low-grade dismissal of your ideas in environments where they should have been received. It was the pattern of being passed over, repeatedly, for opportunities that less gifted people around you were given without question. It was the subtle repositioning of your narrative by people who had decided who you were before you had the chance to show them, and who interpreted every piece of evidence through the lens of that predetermined verdict. It was the exhaustion, the particular and grinding exhaustion, of having to prove yourself in rooms that had already made up their minds about you. These things, strung together across months and years, were designed to do something very specific. They were designed to make you doubt the reality of what God had placed inside you. They were designed to make the fire feel like an illusion, the calling feel like arrogance, the anointing feel like delusion. And there were seasons, if you are honest, when they came close to working. There were moments when you looked at your life and the distance between where you were and where you believed God had called you to go felt so vast that faith itself seemed like a form of madness. There were nights when the gap between the promises you had received in prayer and the reality you were living inside felt not like a season of preparation, but like evidence that you had somehow misheard, misunderstood, or been abandoned by the very God you had staked everything on. Those moments were real. The doubt was real. The grief of it was real. And anyone who tells you that the chosen life is one of unbroken certainty and constant clarity has never truly walked the road that you have walked. The darkness pressed against you in those moments with everything it had. It used your own mind as the battlefield. It used your own memories as ammunition. It reminded you of every failure, every false start, every door that had closed in your face, every person who had left, every dream that had not yet materialized. And it built a case against the goodness of God using the raw material of your own painful experience. But here is what the darkness did not count on. Here is the variable it consistently underestimates in the lives of those who are truly chosen. It did not count on the fact that what God places inside a person cannot be voted out by circumstance. It cannot be canceled by opposition. It cannot be recalled by the enemy simply because the season has gotten hard. 1 Peter chapter 1 verse 5 says that you are shielded by God's power through faith. Shielded. That word carries the image of a military guard, a protective force stationed around something so valuable that God Himself has assigned covering to it. You were never unprotected in the moments when you felt most exposed. You were never unguarded in the seasons when you felt most vulnerable. The shield was always present. The covering was always active. What the enemy was attacking was never the real thing. He was hitting the outer walls of a fortress whose inner keep was being guarded by a force he had no authority to penetrate. And so every attempt to extinguish you failed. Not because you were strong enough to resist it on your own. Not because your faith never wavered or your resolve never cracked. But because the God who placed the fire in you is the same God who keeps the fire burning, and He does not consult the enemy's timeline or yield to the enemy's pressure when it comes to the assignments He has given His chosen ones. The fire in you is not yours to maintain. It was never yours to generate. You did not light it, and you cannot put it out, which means neither can anyone else. It is a divine flame, and it burns according to a will that is higher than the will of every person who ever tried to blow it out with the breath of their discouragement. Think about the specific attempts that were made on the light in your life. Think about the person who told you that your dream was too big, that your vision was unrealistic, that the thing you were believing God for was beyond what someone like you could reasonably expect. Think about the environment that consistently rewarded conformity and penalized the kind of creative, spirit-led thinking that you were built for. Think about the relationship that slowly, almost imperceptibly, began to chip away at the confidence God had built in you, that made you feel like being less of yourself was the price of being loved. Every one of those things was a targeted attack on the light. Every one of them was an attempt, conscious or not, to bring you down to a level where you would no longer pose a threat to the darkness in your sphere of influence. Because that is always the goal, not simply to hurt you. The goal is to neutralize your impact. The goal is to get you small enough that the territory God assigned to you goes unclaimed, that the people you were sent to reach remain unreached, that the darkness that your light was supposed to displace gets to keep its ground. But look at you. You are still here. After everything that was thrown at you, after every season that was designed to end you, after every voice that declared your fire was dying, you are still here, still burning, still carrying the thing that God placed in you before the foundation of the world. That is not your achievement. That is a testimony to the faithfulness of the God who chose you. Isaiah chapter 43 verse 2, revisited in this moment, takes on an even deeper resonance. He said He would be with you in the water. He said the fire would not burn you. And here you are, having passed through both, still standing, still carrying the light, still moving toward the purpose that no opposition has been powerful enough to permanently derail. That is a miracle. You are a miracle. Not in a poetic sense, but in the most literal, most accurate sense of the word. A miracle is a result that cannot be explained by the natural forces that were operating on it. Given what pressed against you, given what was stacked against your continuation, the fact that you are here, that the fire is still burning, that the light is still present in your eyes and your spirit, and your calling is something that defies natural explanation. It requires a supernatural one, and that supernatural explanation is simply this. God did not choose you and then forget about you. God did not light a fire in your life and then walk away and hope for the best. He tends the flame. He guards the deposit. He is actively, continuously, faithfully involved in the preservation of everything He placed in you. Not because you have been perfect, not because you have never stumbled or doubted or gone your own way for a season, but because His gifts and His callings are irrevocable. Romans chapter 11 verse 29 makes that clear. He does not take back what He gives. He does not revoke what He assigns. The anointing on your life was not a trial placement subject to review based on your performance. It was a permanent mark, sealed by the Holy Spirit, guaranteed by the covenant of a God who cannot lie and does not change. So let the attempts to define you in smaller terms than your calling stand as evidence of something they were never intended to prove. Every person who tried to discourage you was unknowingly testifying to the size of what they sensed in you. People do not work this hard to extinguish fires that are not genuinely threatening to the darkness they are comfortable with. The intensity of the opposition is always proportional to the significance of the assignment. If they came at you with everything they had, it is because what God put in you was worth everything they had to spend trying to stop it. The light they could not extinguish was not incidental. It was not a small thing. It was the very thing that heaven needed to remain burning in the exact location where God placed you, for a purpose that is still unfolding, for a season that is still coming, for a world that still needs what you carry. They tried to put it out. They failed. And now the light is still burning, brighter, if anything, for having survived every attempt to dim it. There is a frequency that most people never find. Not because it does not exist, not because it is hidden in some inaccessible place beyond the reach of ordinary human experience, but because finding it requires something that the majority of people are never willing to surrender. It requires the willingness to stop trying to match the world around you. It requires the courage to stop adjusting your signal to fit the receiver, to stop compressing your range to accommodate the limitations of the people closest to you, to stop apologizing for the bandwidth of your soul by pretending to operate on a narrower channel than the one God actually built you for. Most people spend their entire lives making themselves smaller so that others can feel more comfortable in their presence. They turn down the volume of their gifts, silence the depth of their perception, flatten the complexity of their inner world, all in the name of belonging, all in the pursuit of the kind of acceptance that requires them to be less than what they are. And the tragedy is not simply that they diminish themselves. The tragedy is that the world loses what they were carrying. The frequency goes unbroadcast. The signal never reaches the people it was meant to find. You have lived this tension. You know what it feels like to be in a room and to sense things that no one else in the room seems to be picking up. You know what it feels like to see the undercurrent of a situation while everyone around you is reacting only to the surface. You know what it feels like to hear what is not being said, to feel the weight of what is being withheld, to perceive the spiritual atmosphere of a space before a single word has been spoken, and to have no language to offer for what you are experiencing that would make sense to the people beside you. You have tried, at various points in your life, to explain this. You have reached for words to describe the way you receive information from the world around you, the way you process reality on multiple layers simultaneously, the way your spirit registers things that your intellect cannot always immediately categorize. And more often than not, The people you tried to explain it to looked at you with a kind of polite confusion that told you clearly that whatever you were describing, they did not share the experience. And so you learned, slowly, painfully, to keep certain things to yourself, to move through the world with a whole interior landscape that most people around you never knew existed. That interior landscape is not a problem to be managed. It is not a symptom of being overly complicated or emotionally excessive or spiritually grandiose. It is the evidence of a design. It is the fingerprint of a creator who built you to operate on a frequency that was calibrated for a specific purpose, for a specific assignment, for a specific contribution to the unfolding story of God's work in the earth. 1 Corinthians chapter 12 tells us that there are different kinds of gifts but the same Spirit, different kinds of service but the same Lord, different kinds of working but the same God who works all of them in all people. The gifts are diverse because the assignments are diverse. The frequencies are different because the territories are different. What you carry is not the same as what everyone around you carries. Not because you are better, but because you were sent to a different part of the field. You were designed to reach what others cannot reach, to perceive what others cannot perceive, to carry what others were not built to carry. The frequency that makes you feel so different from the people around you is not a malfunction. It is the precise calibration of a divine instrument made for a purpose that has not yet been fully revealed, and this is why the inability to fit in was never rejection. You have interpreted it as rejection in painful seasons of your life, and that interpretation was understandable because rejection and divine recalibration feel almost identical from the inside. Both involve the experience of not belonging where you are. Both produce the ache of reaching for connection and finding that the depth of what you are offering exceeds the capacity of what the environment around you can receive. Both leave you standing at the edge of groups and relationships and communities with the unsettling sense that no matter how hard you try, something essential about you remains unaccommodated. But rejection says you are the problem. Divine recalibration says you are being repositioned. Rejection says you are not enough. Divine recalibration says you are too much for this particular container, and God is moving you toward a space that was built to hold what you carry. The experience is painful in both cases, but the meaning is entirely different. And the meaning is what determines whether the experience breaks you or builds you. Consider the places where you have tried to fit and could not. Consider the communities that should have been home and never quite were. Consider the relationship that held enormous promise in the early days and gradually revealed a ceiling that your spirit could not live beneath. Consider the environments that were comfortable for everyone else and somehow claustrophobic for you, as though the air in that particular space was not calibrated for the kind of breathing that your soul required. Those experiences were not failures of your social ability. They were not evidence of some relational deficiency that you need to correct before you can find your place in the world. They were redirections. They were the loving, sometimes frustratingly gradual, process of a God who knows exactly where you belong, steering you away from the places that would have capped your growth and toward the spaces where everything He placed in you can finally operate without apology. Psalm chapter 16 verse 6 says that the boundary lines have fallen for you in pleasant places. That word boundary does not mean limitation in the way we typically understand limitation. It means placement. It means that God has been involved in the drawing of the lines around your life, in the determining of where you are positioned and where you are not, in the opening and closing of doors, that might have seemed arbitrary from your perspective, but were deeply intentional from His. Every place that would not keep you was a boundary line being drawn by a hand that could see further down the road than you could. Every rejection that stung, every door that closed, every community that could not contain what you carried, was God saying, not here, not yet, not this. Because what I have prepared for you requires a placement that matches your frequency, and I will not let you settle for a signal that diminishes the broadcast. You were built for a different frequency, and that frequency is about to find its tower. The season of operating in environments that cannot fully receive what you transmit is giving way to a new alignment, a new placement, a new community of people who have been calibrated by God to recognize and receive and resonate with exactly what you carry. The isolation you have felt was not permanent exile. It was the silence before the frequency locks in, the quiet that precedes the moment, when the signal finds its range and everything that was scattered and incomplete suddenly snaps into clarity and connection. That moment is approaching. The recalibration is nearly complete, and what you're about to step into will make every season of not fitting make perfect sense in retrospect. Before we continue, there is something we want to share from the heart. This channel lost its YouTube monetization, but the calling on this ministry did not end with it. We continue to create these messages because we believe in what God is doing through this space, and because every week we receive testimony from people whose lives have been genuinely touched by what is spoken here. We do not do this for income. We do this because the assignment is real, and the people who need these words are real. But sustaining this work does carry a cost. If this ministry has meant something to you, if these words have found you in a season where you needed them most, we want to invite you, gently and without any pressure, to consider supporting what we are building here. The link to donate is in the description below and in the pinned comment. Every contribution, no matter how small, goes directly into keeping this ministry alive and growing. And if you are not in a position to give financially, please know that your presence here, your listening, your sharing of these messages with others is itself a form of support that we receive with genuine gratitude. If this message is blessing you today, please like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear that their inability to fit in was never a flaw in their design. Subscribe to this channel if you have not already, because what God is releasing through this space in the coming days is going to go deeper than anything we have shared before. You do not want to miss what is coming. The frequency you carry was always real. The world that can fully receive it is closer than you know. There is a moment in the life of every chosen one when the nature of the attention directed at them changes. It happens gradually, almost imperceptibly at first, like a shift in wind direction that you feel on your skin before your mind has registered that anything is different. The people who were once curious about you become something else. The ones who studied you with the detached interest of an observer trying to solve a puzzle begin to carry a different energy in their watching. The questions they once asked with the appearance of genuine inquiry take on a sharper edge. The conversations they have about you in rooms where you are not present change in tone from analysis to something that sits much closer to alarm. Because something has happened in the dynamic between you and the people who could not figure you out. They have reached a conclusion, not the one they were looking for, not the satisfying resolution that would have allowed them to categorize you and move on, but a conclusion nonetheless. And that conclusion is simply this: you cannot be controlled. And for certain kinds of people, in certain kinds of systems, in certain kinds of relationships, built on the unspoken assumption that everyone has a lever if you look hard enough, the discovery that you have no lever is not met with respect. It is met with fear. This is a dynamic that the chosen have always encountered. It runs through the stories of Scripture like a thread that, once you see it, you cannot unsee. Joseph's brothers did not simply dislike him because of the coat or the dreams. They feared what the dreams implied about the future arrangement of power between them. They feared a version of the story in which Joseph was elevated and they were not, and that fear expressed itself first as contempt and eventually as violence. Saul did not pursue David relentlessly across the wilderness simply out of wounded pride. He feared the anointing. He had felt it leave him and felt it settle on David, and he knew, in the deepest part of whatever spiritual perception he still possessed, that he was in the presence of a man whom God had chosen to carry something he himself had forfeited. And that knowledge, that inability to predict or control or diminish the anointed one before him, produced in Saul a torment that no amount of music could permanently soothe. The pattern is consistent because the spiritual reality behind it is consistent. When those who operate through control encounter someone who cannot be controlled, the response is always the same. The curiosity becomes hostility. The study becomes strategy. The watching becomes warfare. You have felt this transition in your own life. You can probably identify the exact point, or at least the approximate season, when certain people around you stopped being merely confused by you and started being threatened by you. When the dynamic shifted from being studied to being targeted. When you began to notice that the questions being asked about you were no longer coming from a place of trying to understand, but from a place of trying to undermine. When the stories being told about you stopped being attempts to explain your complexity and started being attempts to reduce your credibility. When the energy in certain rooms shifted the moment you walked in, not because people were in awe of you, but because your presence had become, to certain minds and certain agendas, an inconvenience that needed to be managed. Do not be surprised by this. Do not let it destabilize you or cause you to question the reality of what God has placed in you. The targeting is not evidence that you have done something wrong. It is evidence that you have done something right, or more precisely, that you have become something significant enough that the forces opposed to your assignment have taken notice and shifted their strategy accordingly. The enemy does not deploy his heaviest artillery against things that pose no threat. He does not mobilize fear and confusion and coordinated opposition against ordinary targets. The intensity of what has been aimed at you is a form of twisted testimony to the weight of what you carry. If you were not dangerous to the agenda of darkness, darkness would not have invested so heavily in trying to neutralize you. Ephesians chapter 6 verse 12 is a verse that chosen ones must move beyond merely knowing and begin to truly inhabit. We wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this age, against spiritual hosts of wickedness in the heavenly places. The people who shifted from studying you to fearing you, the ones whose confusion curdled into hostility, the ones who began to work against you with a dedication that you could never quite fully explain in purely human terms. They were not the origin of the opposition. They were the instruments of it. Flesh and blood was never your real opponent. What you were navigating in those difficult seasons, what pressed against you with such persistent and coordinated intensity, was a spiritual reality operating through human vessels. Understanding this does not excuse the behavior of the people involved. It does not remove their accountability for the choices they made and the harm they caused. But it reframes the entire battle in a way that changes how you carry it. Because when you understand that the opposition was never really personal, even when it felt devastatingly personal, something begins to shift in the way you relate to those chapters of your story. The betrayals were real. The wounds were real. The damage that was done in seasons of targeted opposition left marks that you are still, in some cases, in the process of healing from. None of that is minimized by understanding the spiritual dimension of what happened. But the poison of bitterness, the corrosive weight of unforgiveness, the exhausting labor of trying to make sense of how people who once claimed to love you could pivot so completely into opposition, all of that begins to lose its grip when you understand that what you were facing was a principality using people, not people acting alone out of pure personal malice. You can grieve what happened without being consumed by hatred for the instruments. You can hold the complexity of having been genuinely hurt by people who were themselves operating under a spiritual influence they may not have even been fully conscious of. And then there is the dimension of this that most people never talk about. The way that being feared by the wrong people is actually a form of divine positioning. When people who operate through manipulation and control discover that you cannot be manipulated or controlled, and when that discovery produces fear in them, their fear creates distance. And that distance, painful as it felt at the time, was often God's most efficient method of removing from your immediate environment the very people whose proximity was limiting your growth. The fear of the wrong people drove them back, and in driving them back, it cleared the space around you for what God wanted to bring forward. The enemies of your destiny unknowingly became the instruments of your repositioning. In trying to push you down, they pushed you out of the environments that were containing you and into the open space where God could move you toward the assignment that required exactly the freedom they had been blocking. Psalm chapter 23 verse 5 carries a revelation that chosen ones should sit with until it changes something in them. God prepares a table for you in the presence of your enemies, not after they leave, not once they have been removed from the picture, in their presence. While they are still watching, while they are still afraid of what they cannot control in you, while they are still circling and calculating and trying to figure out how to neutralize what God has placed in your life. In the middle of all of that, God sets a table. He anoints your head. The cup runs over. The blessing happens not in spite of the opposition, but in the full view of it, so that everyone who feared what you carried gets to watch you be honored by the same God they tried to use against you. This is not vindication for the sake of pride. This is the public demonstration of a faithfulness that needed witnesses. The people who feared you most needed to see that what they feared in you was not your own ambition or strength or cleverness. They needed to see that it was God, and that God finishes what He starts, and that no amount of fear-driven opposition can rewrite the ending of a story that heaven has already authored. You have walked through seasons where you could feel the fear that your presence generated in certain people, and it confused you because you knew your own heart. You knew you were not trying to threaten anyone. You were simply being who you were, following God as faithfully as you could, walking in what He placed in you, without apology and without agenda. And yet the fear was real. The hostility that came from it was real. The opposition it generated was real and consequential and costly. But hear this, chosen one, and let it settle into the places that are still tender from those seasons. The fear of the enemy is the highest compliment that darkness can pay to the light. When darkness fears you, it is because the light in you is real enough, strong enough, and threatening enough to the kingdom of darkness to warrant a response. Ordinary light does not generate that kind of reaction. Candles flicker in the wind without threatening the darkness around them. But a blaze, a genuine, spirit-fed, heaven-sustained blaze, that is something that darkness must strategize against. And you, beloved chosen one, are not a candle. You have never been a candle. You are something that required a strategy. You are something that required an organized opposition. You are something that darkness looked at and said, "We cannot ignore this one. We cannot simply wait this one out. We must move against this one with everything we have." And it moved, and it failed. And you are still here, still burning, still carrying the thing that no amount of fear-driven opposition could extinguish. The moment they could not control you was the moment your true power became visible to the spiritual realm. And the spiritual realm has been responding to that visibility ever since, both the darkness that fears it and the heaven that fuels it. When they could not control you, they feared you. And when they feared you, they revealed something too. The universe that no amount of their opposition could now take back. They revealed that you are the real thing, that what is in you is genuine, that the anointing they sensed was not a performance or a pretension, but a legitimate mark of a God who does not make mistakes about who he chooses. There is a particular kind of wisdom that only comes through being overlooked, not the wisdom that arrives through study or through the accumulation of knowledge gathered in well-lit rooms with willing teachers and open doors, not the wisdom that is handed to those who are recognized early and celebrated often and given every resource and opportunity that their gifts seem to warrant. That kind of wisdom has its own value, certainly, but it has a ceiling because it was never tested in the dark. The wisdom that comes through being overlooked is different in its texture, different in its durability, different in the way it sits in a person and the way it operates when the moment finally comes for it to be deployed. It is the wisdom of someone who learned to hear God in the silence that other people's noise left no room for. It is the wisdom of someone who developed their gifts in the absence of an audience, who built their character in rooms where no one was applauding, who grew into the fullness of their calling in the very seasons that looked from the outside like stagnation or failure or divine abandonment. You are that person, and the wisdom that was deposited in you during the seasons when heaven seemed to have hidden you from the world is about to become one of the most significant assets of the next chapter of your life. God hid you in plain sight. That is the phrase that needs to sit with you for a moment, because it contains a paradox that is worth unpacking slowly. Hidden in plain sight does not mean concealed in a secret location that no one could find. It does not mean removed from the field entirely, placed in some protected holding space away from the action until the right moment. Hidden in plain sight means you were there. You were present. You were in the room, in the relationship, in the environment, in the conversation. People looked directly at you. They interacted with you. They formed opinions about you. They made assessments about your potential and your value and your future. And yet somehow, in a way that only divine wisdom can engineer, they missed the real thing. They saw the surface and drew conclusions. They observed the external circumstances of your life, the slowness of certain seasons, the smallness of certain platforms, the apparent lack of the outward markers of significance that they used to measure whether someone was worth taking seriously, and they filed you away in a category that turned out to be catastrophically wrong. David was hidden in the fields, not hidden in the sense that no one knew he existed, but hidden in the sense that the people making decisions about significance and succession looked right past him. When Samuel came to the house of Jesse to anoint the next king of Israel, Jesse did not even think to call David in from the fields. He presented his other sons, the ones who looked the part, the ones who carried themselves with the visible markers of what a king should be. And he left the shepherd boy outside with the sheep because it simply did not occur to him that the one God was looking for was the one he had already dismissed. God had to ask Samuel directly whether all the young men were present, and only then did Jesse remember the one who was overlooked by his own father, overlooked by the man who knew him best, who had raised him, who had watched him grow. The very proximity that should have given Jesse the clearest view of David's anointing was what made him least able to see it, because familiarity is one of the primary tools that God uses to hide his chosen ones in plain sight. The people closest to you are often the last to recognize what you carry, not because what you carry is not real, but because the ordinariness of daily proximity can make even the extraordinary seem unremarkable. This was your protection and your preparation simultaneously, the obscurity that frustrated you, the seasons when you felt overlooked and undervalued and invisible to the people and the platforms that you believed God was calling you toward. Those seasons were not evidence of divine neglect. They were evidence of divine strategy. Because everything that God was building in you during those seasons required the specific conditions that obscurity provides. It required freedom from the corrupting influence of premature recognition. It required the space to fail without a watching world, drawing conclusions about your worth from your worst moments. It required the quiet in which the deep things of God could be deposited into your spirit without the noise of public performance, drowning out the voice of the teacher. It required the humility that only grows in hidden places, the kind of character that can only be formed when no one is watching, and the choice to do the right thing, to stay faithful, to keep going, carries no immediate social reward. What God was building in you in the hidden seasons was not just a gift to be deployed. It was a person to be trusted with the gift. And persons are not built in the spotlight. They are built in the secret place. Psalm chapter 91 verse 1 says that whoever dwells in the shelter of the Most High will rest in the shadow of the Almighty. That shadow, that place of being covered, of being close enough to God that His presence casts a shadow over your life, is a place of hiddenness that the world cannot access. What is in God's shadow is in God's protection. What is covered by His presence is shielded from the premature exposure that would have ruined what was not yet ready to be revealed. The hiddenness was not punishment. The hiddenness was proximity. God was keeping you close. He was keeping you in the shadow of His own presence, because what He was forming in you was too precious and too important to the purposes of heaven to be exposed before it was strong enough to withstand the weight of the public moment that was coming. And there is something else that the hidden season accomplished that is rarely talked about. It accomplished a sifting of motive that could not have happened any other way. When recognition is withheld, when the platform does not come, when the doors remain closed despite faithfulness and preparation and genuine gifting, the question that gets answered in that season is one of the most important questions a chosen one can ever face. The question is this: will you serve God without the reward? Will you carry the calling without the crowd? Will you remain faithful to what He placed in you, even when every external signal is telling you that it is not working, that you are not seen, that the investment you are making in obedience is producing no visible return? The answer to that question, forged in the fire of prolonged hiddenness, is what makes the difference between a chosen one who can be trusted with a public platform and one who would be destroyed by it. God was not withholding from you. He was preparing you for a weight of responsibility that requires a foundation that cannot be built in a hurry. Now, the unveiling has a specific character in the life of someone who was hidden in plain sight. When it comes, it does not look like something that was constructed by human effort, or engineered by the right connections, or purchased by the right compromises. It looks like what it actually is. It looks like God. It has the unmistakable quality of something that could not have been arranged by any human hand, because the person being revealed was not positioned by human hands to begin with. When God does the revealing, when He lifts the cover from what He has been preparing in secret, the result silences the rooms that were loudest in their dismissal. It answers the questions that were asked with contempt, as though they had always had an obvious answer. It makes the overlooking look like what it always was, not a verdict on the value of the one who was overlooked, but a limitation in the perception of the ones doing the overlooking. The people who missed you when you were in plain sight will not be able to miss you when God makes the reveal. The same eyes that passed over you will be the eyes that witness what God brings forward from the season of hiddenness, and the contrast between what they dismissed and what they are now witnessing will be the testimony that needs no words to accompany it. The life will preach, the emergence will declare. The fruit of the hidden season will speak with a volume and a clarity that no platform or microphone or stage could ever amplify to match. Right now, in this moment, type the words, "I trust the process," in the comments below. Just those 3 words, 4 words at most, as a declaration to your own spirit and to the God who has been hiding you, preparing you, and protecting you in the shadow of His presence. Type it as an act of faith. Type it as a surrender of the timeline you thought you needed to the timeline that heaven has already written. Type it as a statement that you understand, even if only partially, even if only in this moment of clarity that may fade before tomorrow, that the hiddenness was never abandonment. It was always preparation, and the preparation is nearly complete. Something is shifting in the atmosphere around your life right now. Not in the distant future, not in some theoretical tomorrow that requires a certain number of additional trials before it can arrive, but right now, in this present season, in the days that are unfolding around you, even as these words are being spoken into your spirit. There is a movement happening in the unseen realm that has direct and imminent consequences for everything you have been carrying, everything you have been building in the hidden place, everything you have been faithful to in the seasons when faithfulness cost you more than anyone around you knew. The hiddenness is ending. The preparation is transitioning into deployment. The silence that heaven maintained around your life, while it was doing its most important work in you, is giving way to a declaration, and that declaration is not going to whisper. It is going to announce. What was concealed for a season is about to be revealed for eternity, and the world that spent so long trying to figure you out is about to receive an answer that none of its studying could have prepared it for. The unveiling of a chosen one is not a gradual, barely perceptible process. It does not look like a slow accumulation of small improvements that eventually add up to something significant. It looks like the parting of something. It looks like what happens when a curtain is drawn back and the light that was behind it suddenly floods a space that had grown so accustomed to a lesser illumination that it had forgotten what genuine brightness looked like. It looks like the moment in the story of Joseph when Pharaoh looked at him across the room and said, "Can we find anyone like this man, one in whom is the Spirit of God?" Everything that had come before that moment, the pit, the slavery, the false accusation, the prison, the forgotten promise of a fellow prisoner who could have advocated for him, but failed to do so for 2 full years. All of it collapsed into a single moment of divine introduction that rearranged the entire architecture of Joseph's life in the span of a conversation. That is the nature of how God reveals what he has been preparing. Not incrementally, suddenly, not gradually, decisively, not after you have finished suffering enough to have earned it. When the purpose requires it, when the assignment demands it, when the moment has been fully prepared by the same hands that prepared the person, God moves and everything changes at once. You need to understand what this means for you practically, in the specific geography of your current life. It means that the next door that opens may not look like the next logical step in a sequence you have been able to track and predict. It may look like something that has no visible connection to the path you thought you were on. Something that seems to come from a direction you were not watching, offered by a hand you did not expect, in a season that gave you no prior indication that anything was about to shift. That is the signature of divine movement. It does not follow the predictable logic of human systems. It does not respect the timelines that conventional wisdom would assign to the kind of progress you have been making. It operates according to a different calculus entirely, one that factors in not just what you have done, but who you have become. Not just the work of your hands, but the work of God in your heart. Not just the gifts you have developed, but the character that has been forged in the hidden place to carry those gifts without being destroyed by them. Habakkuk chapter 2 verse 3 carries one of the most important instructions that heaven has ever given to a person waiting for a divine promise to materialize. The vision is for an appointed time. It speaks of the end and will not prove false. Though it linger, wait for it. It will certainly come. It will not delay. The appointed time is a concept that deserves more than a passing acknowledgement. It is not simply a comforting idea designed to help impatient people feel better about the fact that nothing is happening yet. It is a statement of divine precision. The appointed time means that the moment of your unveiling has already been scheduled. It was placed on the calendar of heaven before you were born, before the circumstances of your life began to unfold, before the opposition that tried to prevent it gathered its forces, before the hidden season began that felt so long and so silent and so disconnected from the promises you had been given. The appointment was made before any of that, and it has not been canceled by any of it. The linger of the vision was not a sign of its failure. It was a sign of its weight. The things that matter most take the longest to prepare, and what God has been preparing in and through your life has a weight of purpose that required every single day of the season you lived through to be fully ready for the moment that is now approaching. And the approaching of that moment has a sound. It has a feeling. You have been sensing it, which is why certain things that once held your attention have begun to feel less compelling. It is why certain environments that you once felt comfortable in have started to feel constraining in ways you cannot fully articulate. It is why relationships and habits and ways of thinking that served you in an earlier season are beginning to feel like clothing you have outgrown, still wearable in a technical sense, but no longer fitting the dimensions of who you are becoming. That discomfort is not a sign that something is wrong. It is a sign that something is right. It is the natural sensation of a person who is transitioning between one assignment and the next, between one level of their calling and the one that has been prepared to receive what they are now carrying. The old environment feels small because you have grown beyond its capacity to contain you. And God is not asking you to shrink back down to fit it. He is asking you to trust the discomfort as a directional signal, pointing you toward the larger space He has been preparing on your behalf. Isaiah chapter 43 verse 19 is a verse that belongs to this exact season of your life. Behold, God says, I am doing a new thing. Now it springs up. Do you not perceive it? I am making a way in the wilderness and streams in the wasteland. The new thing is already in motion. It is already springing up, which means it is not a future possibility that requires additional conditions to be met before it can begin. It is a present reality that is already emerging, already breaking through the surface of the ground that looked barren, already making a way through the terrain that looked impassable. The question God asks is not whether the new thing will come. He declares that it is already coming. The question is whether you can perceive it, whether your eyes have been trained by the hidden season to see the first signs of what is emerging, whether your spirit is sensitive enough after all the stripping away of the false and the artificial and the convenient that the difficult seasons accomplished, to recognize the genuine movement of God even before it has fully manifested in forms that others can see and verify and celebrate. The unveiling that is beginning in your life is not just about you. It was never only about you. Everything that God deposited in you during the years of preparation, every gift that was developed in obscurity, every character quality that was forged in the fire of being overlooked and misunderstood and underestimated, every dimension of wisdom that was cultivated in the silence of the hidden place, all of it was designed not merely to benefit you, but to flow through you to the people you were sent to reach. There are people who have been waiting for what you carry. There are questions being asked in rooms you have not yet entered that only the answers God placed in you can adequately address. There are wounds in lives you have not yet touched that need precisely the kind of healing that only someone who has been through what you have been through can authentically offer. The unveiling is the beginning of the deployment. The revelation of what God was building in secret is the launch of what He intends to use in the open. And this is why the enemy fought so hard to prevent it. This is why the opposition was so sustained and so coordinated and so relentless. Not because he was trying to hurt you personally, though the personal cost was real, but because he knew what was on the other side of your emergence. He knew the people who would be reached and the territory that would be taken and the chains that would be broken and the lives that would be transformed when the thing that God placed in you was finally released into the fullness of its assignment. He was not fighting the past version of you that was still in the hidden season. He was fighting the future version of you that was about to step into the open. He was fighting the impact before it happened, trying to prevent the emergence before it could occur, because he understood what you were not yet fully able to see about the scope of what God intended to do through your life. But he failed, and the evidence of his failure is the fact that you are still here, still carrying the fire, still resonating with the call that has been on your life from before your first breath. Still believing, even after everything that was thrown at you, that what God promised is real, and that the appointed time is real, and that the vision, though it has lingered, will certainly come. The unveiling has already begun. The curtain is already moving. What was studied in secret is about to be witnessed in public. And not one force in heaven or earth or beneath the earth has the authority to stop what God has already set in motion in your life. The season of being hidden is ending. The season of being revealed is beginning. And what is about to be revealed has been worth every single day of the wait. You were never the question. You were always the answer. That is the truth that has been building beneath every word spoken in this message. The foundation beneath the foundation. the reality that gives meaning to everything that came before it. The ones who studied you, who watched you from across rooms and analyzed you in conversations you were never meant to hear, who circled the mystery of who you are with the persistent, almost compulsive attention of people who cannot leave an unsolved problem alone. They were not simply satisfying curiosity. They were, without knowing it, being drawn towards something they needed. They were being pulled by a gravity they could not name, toward a source they could not identify. And that source was the answer that God had placed inside you, the specific, irreplaceable, divinely engineered response to a question that your generation is asking, that your community is asking, that the people within your sphere of influence have been asking in one form or another for as long as you have known them. This is the weight of what it means to be chosen. It is not a title that elevates you above others in any social or hierarchical sense. It is not a designation that grants you immunity from difficulty or exemption from the ordinary requirements of faithful living. It is a functional calling. It means that you were selected before you were formed, before you drew your first breath, before any of the circumstances of your life had taken shape, to be the specific person who carries the specific answer that a specific group of people in a specific moment in history desperately needs. The choosing was never about your worthiness in comparison to others. God does not choose by comparison. He chooses by assignment. He looks at the need and he looks at the person he designed to meet it. And he makes a connection that is so precise, so carefully fitted, so exactly right that the only word that adequately describes it is chosen. You were chosen for this, for these people, for this moment, for this assignment. And everything you have been through, everything that tried to stop you from arriving at this moment of understanding, was ultimately powerless against the intentionality of the God who made you for it. Think about the people in your life right now who are still in the place you have come through. Think about the ones who are still in the middle of being misunderstood, still carrying the weight of being studied but never truly seen, still navigating the painful gap between who they know they are and who the world around them has decided they must be. Think about the ones who are still in the hidden season, still faithfully tending the field while the house is full of people who did not think to call them in, still believing in a promise that has not yet materialized in any form they can point to as evidence. Those people need what you carry, not what you used to carry before the hard seasons changed you. Not a polished, sanitized version of your story that has had all the difficult parts edited out for the sake of appearance. They need the real thing. They need the testimony of someone who went through the fire and came out not smelling of smoke. They need the voice of someone who was in the pit and kept worshiping. They need the presence of someone who was hidden for so long that they almost stopped believing in their own calling, and yet, by the grace of God, did not stop, did not give up, did not exchange the eternal weight of what they were carrying for the temporary relief of simply laying it down. That person is you. You are the answer they have been circling without knowing what they were looking for. And the emergence that has been building through every section of this message, every layer of truth that has been spoken over your life today, is not just for your benefit. It is for theirs. The unveiling is not a personal achievement. It is a corporate assignment. God is releasing through you in this next season is designed to touch lives that extend far beyond the boundaries of your immediate world, far beyond the people you can currently see and name and count. The ripple of what God has placed in you was always designed to travel further than your arm can reach, further than your voice can naturally carry, further than the geography of your current circumstances would seem to allow. Heaven has already made provision for the distance it intends to cover through your life. Your job is simply to show up fully, to stop shrinking to fit the expectations of people who never had the spiritual vision to see what you were carrying, and to step into the completeness of the assignment with the same faithfulness that kept you going in the seasons when no one was watching. Romans chapter 8 verse 19 says that the creation itself waits in eager expectation for the children of God to be revealed. The whole of creation, the whole of the world that God made and loves and is actively working to restore, is leaning forward in anticipation of the moment when the ones He chose step fully into what they were made for. Not partially, not apologetically, not with one foot in the calling, and one foot still in the old way of seeing themselves through the eyes of people who never had the capacity to accurately perceive them fully, completely, with the authority that comes from knowing who you are, whose you are, what you carry, and why it matters. Creation is waiting for you. The people God assigned to your life are waiting for you. The territory that heaven marked as yours is waiting to be claimed by the one it was set aside for. The waiting is ending. The revealing is beginning, and you are the one it is beginning for. Now, before this message closes, there is something that needs to be said directly and from the heart, because this ministry believes in honoring the people who make it possible with transparency and truth. This channel lost its YouTube monetization, and when that happened, there was a choice to make. Walk away from the work, or continue it for the only reason that ever truly justified it in the first place, which is the calling. We chose the calling. We continue to make these videos week after week, not because there is financial reward attached to it, but because we know, with the kind of knowing that does not require external validation, that these words are reaching the right people at the right moments. We hear from you. We read your messages. We know that someone found this channel in the middle of the night when they were ready to give up, and something spoken here gave them the strength to keep going. That is the reason we are still here. That is the reason we will keep going. But sustaining this work in the practical, real world sense does require resources. And so we want to invite you, with complete sincerity and absolutely no pressure, to consider partnering with this ministry through a donation, if God places it on your heart to do so. The link is in the description below and in the pinned comment on this video. Every amount, no matter how small, goes directly into keeping these messages coming, into the equipment and time and prayer that goes into every single video that reaches you. If you are not in a position to give financially right now, please know that we mean it completely when we say that your presence here is enough. The fact that you listened to this entire message, that you allowed these words to find the places in your spirit that needed them, is something we do not take for granted. You are appreciated beyond what words can adequately express. And if this message has been a word in season for you today, if something spoken here landed in a place that needed landing, please take 30 seconds to like this video before you go. It costs nothing, and it helps more people find what you found here today. Share it with someone who is still in the middle of being studied and misunderstood and underestimated. Someone who needs to hear that their complexity is not a liability but a divine signature. Someone who is waiting for permission to believe that what they carry is real and significant and worth protecting. Be the person who delivers that permission to them today. And if you are not yet subscribed to this channel, please do it now, because what God is speaking through this space is only going to deepen and expand in the days ahead, and every message that is coming has been prepared with the same prayer and intention that went into this one. You came into this message as someone who has been studied because they could not be figured out. You leave it as someone who now understands why. The complexity that confused them was the fingerprint of God on your life. The depth they could not access was the reservoir of an anointing they were never meant to control. The light they could not extinguish was the presence of a God who does not abandon what he consecrates. The frequency they could not match was the specific calibration of a vessel made for an assignment that required exactly that range. The fear that replaced their curiosity was the recognition, however, unconscious, that they were standing in the presence of something they could not manipulate. Something that answered to a higher authority than anything they could offer or threaten. You are not the question. You have never been the question. You are the answer that God wrote before the foundations of the world, and the world about to receive you in the fullness of everything that means.